The dust of the Montana Territory hadn't even settled from the raid, and 7-year-old Mercy Whitfield was already staring up at the man who might as well have been death itself. He was the tallest, most frightening man she had ever laid eyes on. His leather vest was still stained with blood, whose, she didn't dare to guess. His eyes were dark, holding secrets deeper and colder than the canyon shadows that stretched across the plains. He didn't speak a word, and that silence was more terrifying than any war cry she had heard just hours before. But desperation can make a child brave. And Mercy Whitfield had absolutely nothing left to lose. Her papa was dead, her mama was broken, a hollow shell of the woman she used to be. And winter was clawing its way toward the high country, promising a slow, cold end to everything. So she looked up at the silent rancher, this giant of a man, and whispered the words that would change not one, not two, but 3 lives forever. And you won't believe the deal she was about to propose. The morning sun cast long, grim shadows across the burned-out skeleton of the Whitfield homestead. Ezekiel Zeke Blackwood swung himself off his horse, his boots landing softly in the ash-covered dirt. The air was thick with the smell of charred wood and the unmistakable stench of tragedy. He'd seen the pillar of smoke from his own ranch, a good 10 miles south, and had ridden like a man possessed through the night. But he was too late. He was always too late. The Apache had struck with swift, unforgiving brutality. They had left nothing but destruction and sorrow in their wake. This was Zeke's world. He was a man of few words, and even fewer friends. At 32, he had carved his name into this unforgiving land, with his fists and his gun. He'd built a reputation that made other men think twice. The Blackwood Ranch was a sprawling 3,000 acres of some of the most dangerous, beautiful land in the territory. It was a place where outlaws and raiding parties made life a constant gamble for anyone foolish enough to try and tame it. Zeke thrived on that gamble. He preferred the company of danger to the company of men. But Thomas Whitfield, he had been different. The quiet farmer had settled on a piece of land just upstream from Zeke's spread 2 years prior. He'd brought his wife, Constance, and their little girl, Mercy. Unlike the other settlers who usually came crawling to Zeke, begging for protection or trying to cheat him on water rights, Whitfield had just given him a respectful nod when they first met. He'd kept to himself, a good neighbor who never asked for a thing, but was always there to lend a hand. Now, that same good neighbor lay still beside his overturned wagon. 3 arrows were buried deep in his chest, a testament to his final, futile stand. His wife, Constance, sat in the dirt nearby. Her blue dress was torn and stained, her arms wrapped tightly around their daughter. But the woman's eyes were the most horrifying part of the scene. They stared at nothing. Her mind, it seemed, had been shattered by the horrors she had witnessed. Only the little girl, Mercy, seemed truly alive in the aftermath. Her brown hair was a tangled mess of dust and dried tears, but her green eyes, they burned with a fierce determination that made Zeke deeply uncomfortable. It was a look he recognized. He saw it in the mirror every single morning. She looked up as his long shadow fell across them, and he saw her small body tense, like a cornered coyote ready to fight to the death. "Mama won't talk," Mercy said. Her voice was a quiet, raspy whisper. "She ain't said a single word since they took Papa. I tried to give her water, but she just stares. She just stares right through me." Zeke knelt, his joints groaning in protest from the long, hard ride. Up close, he could see that Constance Whitfield was breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow little breaths. But her spirit seemed to have fled her body, trailing after her husband's last gasp. Her hands trembled without stopping. Dried tears had carved pale streaks down her dust-caked face. "How long ago?" Zeke asked, his voice rough and gravelly from disuse. "Yesterday morning," Mercy replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her small frame. "They came at dawn. Papa, he tried to fight them, but there were just too many. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. They took our horses, and most everything else. And then they left. Zeke stood up, his gaze sweeping over the utter devastation. The house was nothing more than a skeleton of blackened timbers, a ghostly silhouette against the morning sky. Miraculously, the barn had been spared. A few chickens were pecking nervously in the yard, a surreal touch of normalcy in the middle of a nightmare. He could hear a lone cow mooing mournfully from somewhere behind the barn. The raiders had taken what was valuable and destroyed the rest for sport. It was a pattern he had seen far too many times. "You got any kin?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. This was the edge of the world. People came here to escape their kin, not to be near them. Mercy shook her head, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Papa said we came west to start fresh. He said the old life was behind us now." She glanced at her mother's vacant, beautiful face. "Mama needs a doctor, doesn't she?" "Nearest doctor's in Willow Creek," Zeke said, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. "It's a 3-day ride from here." "We ain't got no horse," Mercy stated, not as a complaint, but as a simple, brutal fact. "They took both our mares." Zeke found himself trapped. He had lived alone for 8 long years, ever since he had buried his past in a shallow grave back in Texas. He had chosen solitude on purpose. He knew, better than anyone, that caring for other people only ever led to one thing: pain. But as he looked at this broken woman and her fiercely protective child, he knew he couldn't just turn his back. He couldn't just ride away and leave them to the wolves, both the 4-legged and 2-legged kind. Something inside him, a part of him he thought was long dead and buried, wouldn't let him. "I'll take you to town," he said finally, the decision tasting like ash in his mouth. "Pack what you can carry." Mercy looked around at the smoldering ruins of her home, her life. "Ain't much left to pack," she said with a sad finality. She stood up and gently tried to pull her mother to her feet. "Come on, Mama. We have to go. The nice man's going to help us." Constance allowed herself to be lifted, but she moved like a puppet with its strings cut. Her eyes never focused, never registered the world around her. Zeke watched the little girl, all of 7 years old, struggle with her mother's dead weight, and he felt that old, familiar twist in his gut. He had seen that exact look of vacant despair before. He had seen it in the mirror on the day he'd buried his own wife and son. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "We need to go now." Constance slowly turned her head toward the sound of his voice. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, her eyes seemed to clear, a flicker of recognition. "Thomas?" she whispered, her voice a fragile, hopeful sound. Mercy's face crumpled. "No, Mama. Papa's gone." The words tore from her throat. "This is Mr. Blackwood. He's going to help us." The brief spark of clarity in Constance's eyes vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The fog rolled back in, leaving her staring at a world only she could see. Zeke sighed, a sound of pure weariness. He lifted her effortlessly into his arms and settled her on his horse, placing her behind the saddle. Mercy scrambled up right after her, her small arms wrapping around her mother's waist like a vice, a tiny anchor in a storm-tossed sea. The ride to Willow Creek should have taken 3 days. It took them 4. The journey was a living hell. Constance was a ghost who had to be helped to eat and drink. She would wander away from their camp in the dead of night, a silent, spectral figure disappearing into the darkness, forcing Zeke to track her down like a lost calf. Twice he found her standing at the edge of a ravine, staring down into the blackness, and he had to physically pull her back from the brink. Through it all, Mercy was a rock. She never complained. She never cried. She just took care of her mother with a quiet, solemn dedication that made Zeke's throat feel tight. She was a child forced to be an adult, and it was a terrible, beautiful thing to witness. On the second night, As they camped beside a small gurgling stream, Mercy approached him. He was sitting by the fire, poking at the flames, lost in his own dark thoughts. "Mr. Blackwood?" she said quietly. He looked up. The firelight danced in her wide, serious eyes. "What happens to us in town?" she asked. Zeke jabbed the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks spiraling up into the vast, indifferent night sky. "The doctor will look at your mama," he said gruffly, "and the preacher. He might know of some folks who are looking to take in a new hand, or a child." "What if nobody wants us?" she pressed. "What if nobody wants a broke lady and a little girl?" The question hung in the cold night air between them, heavy and sharp. Zeke had seen enough of the world to know the answer. He'd seen what happened to widows and orphans on the frontier. Without family, without resources, their options were limited, and all of them were grim. "Don't you go borrowing trouble," he said finally, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. But Mercy was not to be deterred. She was like a tiny, relentless bulldog. "You got a wife, Mr. Blackwood?" The question was so unexpected it was like a slap in the face. He looked at her sharply, his eyes narrowing. Where was this going? "No," he bit out. "You ever think about getting one?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "No," he repeated, more forcefully this time. Mercy was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the flickering firelight. Then she dropped the bomb. "My mama's real pretty when she ain't sad," she said, her voice dropping to an earnest, conspiratorial whisper. "And she can cook better than anybody. She makes these biscuits that they taste like clouds." Zeke felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. This conversation was veering into dangerous territory. "She ain't always been like this, you know," the little girl continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Before Papa died, she used to sing while she worked, all the time. She knew all kinds of songs, and she was teaching me how to sew and how to read from the good book. She's a real good mama. She got lost." Zeke stood up abruptly, needing to put distance between himself and this child's impossible hope. "You should get some sleep," he muttered, turning his back to the fire. But as he walked away into the darkness, he could feel Mercy's eyes burning into his back. He knew, with a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, that she had just planted a seed. A wild, impossible, dangerous idea had taken root in her young mind. And he had a terrible feeling it was about to grow into something he couldn't control. Willow Creek was less of a town and more of a scar on the landscape. It was a rough, grimy collection of saloons, gambling halls, and businesses that catered to the basest needs of men. It existed for one reason: to separate hard-working cowboys and lucky miners from their money. There was a small, dusty church at one end of the main street and a sprawling, neglected cemetery at the other. The symmetry of it seemed grimly appropriate to Zeke. Dr. Harrison was a tired-looking man in his 60s. He had the weary, washed-out eyes of a man who had seen far too much suffering to be surprised by anything anymore. He examined Constance in his small, cluttered office above the general store, while Zeke and Mercy waited on the landing outside, the silence stretching between them. When the doctor finally emerged, he was wiping his hands on a stained cloth. He looked at Zeke, then his eyes softened as they fell on Mercy. "Her body is fine," he said, his voice raspy. "She's strong. But her mind... Sometimes the spirit just breaks under the weight of it all. I've seen it before, especially in women who've lost everything in a single blow. Some of them come back from it. Some of them don't." "What can we do?" Mercy asked, her small voice trembling for the first time. "Time," the doctor said with a sigh, "and prayer, if you're inclined. Keep her safe, keep her fed, and hope that her mind finds its way back home." He placed a gentle hand on Mercy's shoulder. "That's all anyone can do." It wasn't an answer. It was a death sentence. Zeke paid for a room at the town's only respectable boarding house, a grim, joyless establishment run by a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Fletcher. He paid for a full week's lodging in advance, the stack of coins feeling like stones in his hand. He left Constance and Mercy there, telling them he was going to speak with the town preacher about finding a more permanent solution. Reverend Collins was a kind man with a shock of silver hair and gentle, compassionate eyes. But his face grew grave as Zeke explained the situation. He listened patiently, his hands steepled under his chin, his expression becoming more and more somber with every word. "I wish I could offer you some good news, Mr. Blackwood," the preacher said, his voice low and sorrowful. "But the truth is, this is a hard place. There aren't many families hereabouts with the means or the inclination to take in a woman and a child. And with Mrs. Whitfield, in her current state," he shook his head slowly, "most folks have more than enough troubles of their own. They fear what they don't understand." "What about back east?" Zeke asked, grasping at straws. "Orphanages? Asylums?" "That would mean separating them," the preacher said, his eyes filled with pity. "And even if we could arrange it, the journey alone would cost more than most folks here see in a year. I am truly sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I will pray on it. I will ask around, but I cannot, in good conscience, promise you anything." Zeke left the church feeling like he was carrying a mountain on his shoulders. He had done his duty. He had brought them to town. He had put a roof over their heads. He could, by all rights, get on his horse and ride back to his ranch, back to his solitude, and never look back. But the thought of leaving them there, in this predatory town, gnawed at him like a cancer. Mercy was too smart, too young, too full of fire, and Constance was too broken, too vulnerable. They wouldn't survive long in a place like Willow Creek. The wolves would circle, and they would close in. He found Mercy sitting on the boarding house porch, her small legs dangling over the edge, watching the dusty street with an unnerving stillness. Constance was visible through the window behind her, a motionless silhouette, staring out at nothing. "The doctor says Mama might get better," Mercy said without looking at him. Her voice was flat. "That's good news," Zeke lied. "But you talked to the preacher, didn't you?" She continued, her voice still devoid of emotion. "About finding us a home." Zeke slumped down heavily into the wooden chair beside her. The wood creaked under his weight. He's looking into it." Mercy was quiet for a long, long time. The only sounds were the distant clinking of glasses from a nearby saloon and the lazy buzz of flies. Then she said, "You're going back to your ranch tomorrow, ain't you?" "Yes." The word was a single, hard stone in his throat. "And we're staying here." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Zeke could only nod. Mercy drew her knees up to her chest and wrapped her small arms around them, making herself as small as possible. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice now barely a whisper, "about what I said, by the fire, about you needing a wife." "Mercy, that's—" "Please," she interrupted, turning to face him for the first time. Her voice was small, but it was filled with a terrifying determination. "Please, just let me say this." He fell silent, waiting. "I know you don't want us," she began, the words coming out in a measured, practiced rhythm. "I know we're just trouble that you got stuck with. But my mama, she needs somebody to take care of her, and I need somebody to take care of both of us." She took a shaky breath. "And you live all alone on that big, beautiful ranch. Don't you ever get lonely, Mr. Blackwood?" Zeke felt his chest tighten, the air suddenly thick and hard to breathe. "It's not that simple, Mercy." "Why not?" she demanded, and now he could see the tears shimmering in her green eyes, bright and unshed. "Why isn't it simple? Mama's real pretty, and she's good, and she's kind. When she gets better, and she will get better, she'll work hard for you. She'll cook and clean, and she'll mend your clothes. And I'll help too. I can gather eggs and feed the chickens, and I can learn to do whatever you need me to do. I learn fast." "Mercy, you don't understand," he said, his voice strained. "I understand plenty," she shot back, her voice rising with a fierce, desperate energy. "I understand that we have nowhere else to go. I understand that winter's coming and we'll probably freeze or starve to death if we stay here. And I understand," she took another deep breath, her small body trembling, "that you're a good man, Mr. Blackwood, even if you pretend you ain't." She scrambled to her feet and stood before him, her small hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. She looked like a tiny warrior facing down a giant. "Please," she whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of her, replaced by a raw, heart-wrenching plea. "Marry my mama, mister. She's all I have left in this world, and I can't take care of her all by myself. Please." The words hit Zeke like a physical blow. He saw himself, a small, terrified boy, standing over 2 fresh graves in Texas, begging strangers to help him, to not leave him alone. The memory was a lifetime ago, but the pain was still as sharp as a shard of glass in his heart. It cut through all the walls he had so carefully built around himself, all the defenses he had spent 8 years perfecting. "Your mama doesn't even know who I am half the time," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. It was his last line of defense. "But she's still in there," Mercy insisted, her voice full of a conviction that defied all logic. "I see her sometimes, in her eyes, just for a second. She just needs time, and she needs somebody to love her back to herself." Zeke stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, his back to the child. He stared out at the dusty, indifferent street, at the rough men coming and going from the saloons. A part of him, the sensible, self-preserving part, was screaming at him to get on his horse and ride. Ride fast and far, back to his solitary life where feelings couldn't touch him, where loss couldn't find him. But another part of him, a part he had thought long dead and buried with his family, was stirring to life. It was being resurrected by the impossible courage of this tiny, desperate girl. "It wouldn't be a real marriage," he said at last, his voice rough. He wasn't speaking to her anymore. He was speaking to himself, trying to make sense of the madness he was contemplating. "Not at first. Your mama's not... She's not able to consent to such a thing." "I know," Mercy said softly from behind him. "But maybe someday, when she's better." "And if she never gets better?" The question was brutal, but it had to be asked. Mercy was quiet for a long moment. He could hear her ragged breathing. "Then at least she'll be safe," she said finally, "and warm, and fed, and with me. That's more than we have now, mister. It's everything." That night, Zeke lay awake in his small, lumpy hotel bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling. He was trying to rationalize the decision that was solidifying in his mind. He had sworn off attachments. He had sworn off love. He had come to Montana to disappear, to live out his days as a ghost among the mountains, free from the risk of ever loving and losing again. When disease had taken his wife, Sarah, and their infant son, it had taken his soul with them. He had nothing left to give, but Mercy's words echoed in the darkness, relentless and unforgiving. "She's all I have now." He understood that kind of desperation. He understood that fierce, primal need to protect the last shred of family you had left. And he was horrified to admit, even to himself, that he cared what happened to these 2 broken strangers. Their fate had somehow become tangled up with his own. The next morning, he found them in the boarding house dining room. Mercy was patiently helping her mother eat a bowl of oatmeal, guiding the spoon to her mouth as if she were a baby. Constance chewed and swallowed mechanically, her eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point over Mercy's shoulder. Zeke pulled up a chair and sat down across from them. Mercy looked up, her eyes wide and questioning. "I've been thinking about what you said," Zeke told her quietly. A tiny flicker of hope ignited in the girl's eyes, It was so bright it was painful to look at. It wouldn't be easy, he continued, laying out the hard truths. My ranch is isolated. The winters are brutal. There are no other women around, no school for you. I can read already, Mercy said eagerly, leaning forward. Papa taught me, and I ain't afraid of hard work. I promise. And your mama, Zeke said, his gaze shifting to Constance's beautiful, empty face. She might never be the same. I know, Mercy whispered, her voice steady. But at least we'd be together. And we'd be safe. With you. Zeke looked at Constance. She was pretty, he supposed, in a fragile, porcelain doll sort of way. Her golden hair was dull and lifeless, her fine features smudged with a deep, abiding sorrow. But it was her brokenness that reached out and grabbed him. It was the same profound, soul-deep brokenness that he carried inside himself. They were two sides of the same cracked coin. All right, he said, the words feeling foreign and momentous on his tongue. Mercy's face lit up like a sunrise over the mountains. Her whole body seemed to vibrate with a joy so pure it was almost holy. Really? You mean it? You'll really do it? But we do this proper, Zeke said, his voice firm. I'll speak to the preacher about a ceremony, a legal one, and I'll make it clear to everyone in this town and anyone else who needs to know that you're my family now, that anyone who wants to hurt you will have to answer to me. You mean it, she breathed, the words full of awe. I mean it, Zeke confirmed, and as he said it, he felt something loosen deep in his chest. A knot he had been carrying for 8 long years, a knot of grief and solitude and bitterness, had just come undone. Go pack your things, he said, a strange, unfamiliar feeling rising in him. It might have been hope. We'll be married this afternoon. We head home tomorrow. The wedding was one of the strangest, saddest affairs the territory had ever seen. Reverend Collins performed the brief ceremony in his small, dusty church. Dr. Harrison and the grim-faced Mrs. Fletcher served as the unwilling witnesses. Constance stood beside Zeke at the altar, dressed in her cleanest, patched-up dress. Her eyes remained vacant and unfocused throughout the entire service. When the preacher asked if she, Constance Marie Whitfield, took this man to be her lawfully wedded husband, there was a long, awkward silence. Finally, Mercy, standing on her mother's other side, leaned in and whispered the words, I do, into her ear. Constance repeated them like a parrot, her voice a flat, hollow echo in the quiet church. Zeke spoke his own vows clearly and loudly, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. He promised to protect and provide for both Constance and Mercy, to shield them from harm, for as long as they all should live. As he slipped a simple gold band onto Constance's limp, unresponsive finger, a ring he'd purchased from the general store just an hour earlier, he had a fleeting, terrifying thought. What in God's name have I done? But then he glanced down at Mercy. The little girl was beaming, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated relief. And in that moment, Zeke knew that, right or wrong, there was no turning back. The ride back to the Blackwood Ranch felt different this time. It took only 2 days. Constance rode behind Zeke on his powerful black stallion, her arms wrapped loosely around his waist. Her presence was a warm, solid weight against his back. Mercy rode alongside them on a gentle, sure-footed mare Zeke had bought for her in town. The little girl was a different person now. She chattered nervously the entire way, a constant stream of questions and observations, pointing out deer and hawks, asking about the ranch, about the cattle, about Zeke's life. It was as if a dam of silence had burst inside her. Constance, however, remained a ghost. As they finally crested the last hill and the Blackwood spread came into view, Zeke felt an unexpected surge of pride. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a very long time. The ranch house was solid and well built, crafted from dark, sturdy timber with a wide front porch and real glass windows, a rare luxury in this part of the country. The barn and outbuildings were all in good repair. His cattle, hundreds of them, dotted the valley floor like dark specks against the vast sea of golden grass. This was his kingdom, a kingdom he had built with his own 2 hands. It's beautiful, Mercy breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. All of this is yours, far as you can see in any direction, Zeke said, a hint of pride in his rough voice. And some you can't. He had built this house with his own hands, felling the timber from his own mountainside, hauling the stone from his own creek bed. He had built it larger than he needed for just one man, a foolish bit of hope from a lifetime ago. But now he was profoundly grateful for the extra space. The inside of the house was sparsely furnished, but it was clean and orderly. There was a large main room dominated by a massive stone fireplace. The kitchen had a proper cast-iron stove, and there were 3 bedrooms. For years, Zeke had lived in just one of them, using the other 2 for storage. Now he hastily cleared them out. "You and your mama can have the big bedroom," he told Mercy, gesturing to the largest room at the end of the hall. "It gets the morning sun. I'll take the small one next to it." Mercy explored the house with a sense of awe. After the tiny one-room cabin she had shared with her parents, this place seemed like a palace. "It's got real wood floors," she said, running her small hand over the smooth, polished planks as if they were made of gold. Constance moved through the house like a sleepwalker. She touched nothing. She saw nothing. Zeke gently guided her to a sturdy rocking chair by the main window, and she sat down obediently, her gaze fixed on the distant, jagged peaks of the mountains. That first night was painfully awkward. Zeke cooked a simple meal of beans and bacon, the silence in the large kitchen feeling heavy and oppressive. Mercy unpacked their few meager belongings, carefully folding her mother's dresses and placing them in the large wooden wardrobe. Constance ate the food that was placed in front of her, but she remained locked away in her silent world. After supper, Mercy helped her mother into a clean white nightgown and tucked her into the big bed in their new room. Then she curled up on the mattress beside her, a small, fiercely protective guardian. Zeke lay awake for hours in his own bed in the next room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around its new occupants. The soft creak of floorboards, the faint sound of Mercy humming a lullaby to her mother, the whisper of the wind outside. What have I done? The question hammered at him again and again. He was a rancher, a fighter. He knew how to handle cattle and horses and men with bad intentions. He knew nothing about caring for a broken woman and a traumatized little girl. He was in over his head, drowning in a sea of responsibility he had never wanted. But then, through the thin wall, he heard Mercy's soft humming again, a sweet, sad, hopeful little tune. And the sound, for some reason, eased the tightness in his chest. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, slept without dreaming of the ghosts of his past. He was too busy dealing with the ghosts of the present. The very next morning brought their first real test, and it was a terrifying one. Zeke woke to the sound of frantic, high-pitched calling. He threw on his pants and burst out of his room to find Mercy, her face pale with terror, searching the house. "She's gone!" Mercy cried, her voice cracking with panic. "She was right here when I went to sleep, but now she's gone. The bed is empty." A cold dread washed over Zeke. He grabbed his rifle from its rack by the door, his mind instantly cataloging the dangers. Wolves, bears, a sheer drop-off into the creek not 100 yards from the house. A woman in her nightgown, with her mind gone, wouldn't last an hour out there. They found her, not 10 minutes later, and the sight stopped Zeke dead in his tracks. Constance was standing in the exact center of his largest pasture, barefoot in her white nightgown, surrounded by a curious ring of cattle. The morning mist swirled around her ankles, making her look like an apparition, a spirit of the prairie. She was staring intently at the eastern horizon, at the rising sun, as if waiting for someone to appear. Her feet were already cut and bleeding from her trek across the rocky ground. Her beautiful golden hair was tangled with burrs and bits of dried grass. She didn't respond when they called her name. She didn't even turn her head. Zeke approached her slowly, cautiously, the way he would approach a spooked horse. He kept his voice low and steady. "Constance," he said gently, "it's time to come inside. It's cold out here." She slowly turned her head toward him, but her eyes looked right through him, as if he wasn't there. "Thomas?" she whispered, a fragile, hopeful sound that twisted a knife in Zeke's gut. "Is that you? Did you come back for me?" "No, Constance," Zeke said softly, his heart aching for her, for Mercy, for all of them. "It's Zeke, your husband now. Remember? You're safe here." He reached out and, without a word, lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, as fragile as a bird. He carried her back to the house, his boots leaving dark prints in the dew-covered grass. Mercy ran ahead of them, her face a mask of worried concentration, and had a bowl of warm water and clean cloths, ready by the time he laid Constance down on her bed. As Mercy gently cleaned and bandaged her mother's cut feet, the terrible reality of their situation settled over Zeke like a shroud. Constance couldn't be left alone, not for a minute. This meant his entire life, his entire routine, had to change. He couldn't ride the far fences anymore. He couldn't be gone for days on end during roundup. His world, which had once been as vast as the Montana sky, had just shrunk to the size of this small ranch house and the woman who haunted it. The days that followed fell into a strange, new pattern. Zeke would rise before the sun to tend to the nearest of the cattle and check the fences closest to the house, always, always keeping the ranch house in his sight. He felt like a guard on a prison wall. Mercy, meanwhile, proved to be a force of nature. For a 7-year-old, she was remarkably capable, a tiny whirlwind of domestic activity. She helped with the cooking, the cleaning, the mending, and she watched over her mother with the fierce, unwavering devotion of a she-wolf guarding her cub. Constance continued to exist in a world of her own making. It was a place of deep, silent fog. Sometimes she would sit in her rocking chair for hours on end, motionless, staring out the window. Other times, a restless energy would seize her, and she would wander through the house, touching things, rearranging objects, a ghost tidying her own tomb. If she wasn't watched constantly, she would drift out the door and into the wilderness. Occasionally she would speak, but the words were nonsensical, fragmented echoes of a life that was gone. Once, Zeke came into the kitchen to find her at the table, kneading a bowl of dirt from the garden. Her hands were moving with the practiced, confident motions of a baker, following the ghost of a recipe she remembered but could no longer grasp. She was trying to make biscuits. "She's trying to come back," Mercy said one evening. They were sitting on the porch, watching Constance trace patterns on the dusty floorboards with her finger. "I can tell. Sometimes she looks at me, and it's like she almost remembers who I am." Zeke had his doubts, grave doubts, but he kept them to himself. He had grown fiercely protective of Mercy's stubborn, determined optimism. It was a fragile flame in a world of darkness, and he would not be the one to snuff it out. He would guard her hope as fiercely as she guarded her mother. And then, one day, the first real miracle happened. It was 3 weeks after their arrival at the ranch, 3 long weeks of the same monotonous, soul-crushing routine. Zeke was in the barn, mending a broken harness, the smell of leather and hay thick in the air, and then he heard it. Singing. It was a woman's voice, clear and sweet as a mountain spring, drifting across the yard from the house. He dropped his tools, his heart hammering against his ribs. He walked toward the house, his boots silent in the dust, hardly daring to breathe for fear of breaking the spell. There, on the front porch, sat Constance. She was sitting in her rocking chair, and Mercy was sitting on a stool at her feet. And Constance was braiding the little girl's long brown hair. As her fingers moved with a deft, familiar grace, she was singing an old hymn, her voice pure and true and heartbreakingly beautiful. When she finished the song, she tied off the braid with a small piece of ribbon. Then she looked up and saw Zeke standing there in the yard, watching them. A look of mild surprise crossed her face. "Hello," she said simply. Her voice was calm and clear. It was as if she were seeing him for the very first time. "Hello?" he replied carefully, his own voice sounding rough and unsteady. He took a tentative step closer. How are you feeling today, Constance?" She considered the question seriously, her head tilted to one side. A small frown creased her brow. "Confused," she said at last. "I feel very confused. I keep having this dream about fire and screaming, but I can't remember why." She looked down at her own hands, as if they belonged to a stranger. "And sometimes I see a man's face. He has kind eyes, but I can't remember his name." "That was Papa," Mercy said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "His name was Thomas." A shadow of pain, sharp and visceral, flickered across Constance's face. "Thomas," she repeated, the name a strange and bitter taste on her tongue. "Yes, I think I remember." Her gaze shifted back to Zeke, her eyes filled with a genuine, searching curiosity. "Who are you?" "I'm Zeke," he said, his voice gentle. "Zeke Blackwood." He hesitated for a fraction of a second. I'm your husband now." Constance frowned, the confusion returning. "I don't remember marrying you," she said, her voice betraying a hint of alarm. "You were hurt," Zeke explained quickly, softly. "After what happened to Thomas, there was a raid. I found you and Mercy. I brought you here. I married you. To keep you and Mercy safe." She absorbed this incredible information slowly, her blue eyes scanning his face, searching for the truth. He stood perfectly still, letting her look. Finally, she gave a small, weary nod. That was very kind of you, Mr. Blackwood," she said formally. Then, a ghost of a wry smile touched her lips. "But I should warn you. I don't think I'm very good company these days." The moment of clarity, this miraculous break in the clouds, lasted for only a few precious hours. By evening, the fog had rolled back in, and Constance had once again retreated into her distant, silent world. But it was enough. It had given them all a powerful, intoxicating dose of hope. She was still in there. Mercy had been right all along. Over the following weeks, the moments of awareness became more frequent, and they lasted longer. They were like brief, tantalizing glimpses of the woman she had been before tragedy had shattered her world. During one of these lucid periods, she asked Zeke about his life, about who he was before he had found them. And to his own astonishment, he told her. He found himself sitting across the kitchen table from her, the afternoon sun streaming through the window, telling her about Texas, about his Sarah, about his infant son, Daniel, about the yellow fever that had swept through their small town and taken them both in the span of a week. He told her about the crushing, suffocating guilt and the all-consuming grief that had driven him north, to this empty land, to escape a past that was too painful to bear. He told her things he had never spoken aloud to another living soul. When he was finished, the silence in the room was profound. Constance reached across the table and placed her hand gently on his. Her touch was warm and comforting. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" she said softly, her eyes filled with a deep, knowing sadness. "Both of us broken by loss." "Maybe," Zeke replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Maybe that's why we understand each other. As the vibrant colors of autumn deepened into the stark grays of early winter, their strange little makeshift family settled into a comfortable, domestic rhythm. Mercy, it turned out, was as bright as she was determined. Zeke found himself taking on the role of a father, teaching her the things Thomas would have taught her. He taught her how to ride properly, not just hang on. He taught her how to read the weather in the clouds, how to track game, how to handle a rifle with safety and respect. She soaked it all up like a thirsty sponge, hungry for the knowledge, but even hungrier for the attention, for the simple, profound act of being cared for. Constance's condition continued to improve, slowly but steadily. She began to have more good days than bad, and on her good days, she threw herself into the role of a ranch wife with a fierce, almost desperate energy, as if she were trying to make up for lost time. She cooked elaborate, delicious meals that filled the house with wonderful smells. She scrubbed the floors until they gleamed. She mended their clothes and even started sewing new dresses for herself and Mercy from bolts of calico Zeke had picked up in town. "She's trying to earn her keep," Mercy explained to Zeke one evening, as they watched Constance humming to herself while she churned butter. "She feels bad about being a burden to you." "She's not a burden," Zeke said gruffly, and he was shocked to realize that he meant it. Somewhere along the way, without him even noticing, he had stopped thinking of Constance and Mercy as obligations he had been saddled with. They were no longer just trouble he was stuck with. He had started thinking of them as his family. The first snow came early that year, a thick, pristine blanket of white that transformed the rugged landscape into a place of silent, breathtaking beauty. Zeke woke one morning to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. He walked into the kitchen and found Constance standing at the window, fully dressed and completely, utterly lucid. "Good morning," she said without turning around. Her voice was calm and steady. "The snow is beautiful, isn't it? So clean, so peaceful." "Good morning," Zeke replied, coming to stand beside her at the window. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said simply. "Clearer. It's like the snow came and washed away some of the fog in my head." She finally turned to look at him, her blue eyes clear and direct. "I remember more now," she said softly. "About Thomas. About what happened. About you saving us." They stood in a comfortable, easy silence for a long time, watching the fat, lazy snowflakes drift down from the gray sky. Then Constance said, her voice so quiet he could barely hear it, "I know this isn't what you wanted, Zeke, this life, a broken woman and someone else's child. But I want you to know that I'm grateful. So very grateful." She took a deep breath. "And I would like to try, to be a real wife to you, if you'll have me." Zeke's heart, which he had thought was a dead, useless muscle, gave a powerful lurch in his chest. "I know you loved your first wife," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "and I know I can never be her. I would never try. But maybe we can build something new together, something good, something that honors what we've both lost, without being trapped by it." He turned to face her fully. He saw not the broken, fragile woman he had rescued, but a woman of incredible strength and resilience, a woman who had walked through the deepest hell and was fighting her way back to the light. And he felt a wave of admiration and affection for her that was so powerful, it almost knocked him off his feet. "I'd like that, Constance," he said, his voice husky. "I'd like that more than you know." She smiled then. It was the first real, genuine smile he had ever seen from her, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. It transformed her face, illuminated her from the inside out, and in that moment, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "Then we'll start fresh," she said, her voice full of a newfound hope. "Today. Right now." And from that day forward, their marriage truly began. It was a slow, careful courtship between two deeply wounded souls learning how to trust, how to hope, how to love again. But it was real. and it was powerful. Constance proved to be everything Mercy had promised and more. She was kind, she was hard-working, and she possessed a quiet, gentle strength that perfectly complemented Zeke's rougher, harder edges. They fit together, like two broken pieces that somehow made each other whole. But peace in this land was a fragile and fleeting thing. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and bringing the world back to life. And with the thaw came trouble. A neighboring rancher named Jedediah Fletcher, no relation to the boarding house owner, had been coveting Zeke's land, and more importantly, his generous water rights, for years. Fletcher was a greedy, ruthless man with a reputation for taking what he wanted. When he learned that Zeke, the solitary wolf of the high country, now had a family to protect, he saw not a reason to back off, but an opportunity. He saw a weakness he could exploit. Fletcher arrived one morning with 6 of his hired guns, all of them armed and looking for a fight. They rode right into Zeke's yard as if they owned the place. Zeke met them on the porch, his rifle cradled casually in his arms, his expression as hard and unyielding as granite. "Blackwood," Fletcher said, not even bothering to dismount. He was a big, beefy man with a sneer permanently etched on his face. "I hear you got yourself a wife and a kid now. That's real nice." He let his eyes drift toward the house, where Constance and Mercy were watching from the window. "Be a real shame if something happened to them." The air grew thick and cold. "Are you threatening my family, Fletcher?" Zeke's voice was deadly quiet, stripped of all emotion, which made it all the more menacing. "Just making conversation," Fletcher replied with a cold, smug smile. "Thing is, a man with a family, he has more to lose. It makes him more reasonable. I'm thinking you might want to reconsider my generous offer for your water rights before things get complicated." Zeke took a slow step off the porch. Fletcher's men shifted nervously in their saddles, their hands hovering near their pistols. They knew Zeke's reputation. They knew this was a dangerous game. "Let me make something perfectly clear to you, Jedediah," Zeke said, his voice like the scrape of steel on stone. "You come on my land again, you threaten my family again, and I will kill you. I won't run you off. I won't warn you again. I will put you in the ground. Do you understand me?" Fletcher's smile faltered. The cold, hard certainty in Zeke's eyes was not a bluff. He had heard the stories about Zeke's past in Texas, about what he had done to the last men who had crossed him. He had thought they were just tall tales. Looking into Zeke's dead calm eyes, he realized they probably weren't. "Now see here, Blackwood. Get off my land," Zeke said simply. The words were not a request, they were a command. Fletcher hesitated for a moment, his face turning a blotchy red. Then, with a curse, he yanked on his reins and led his men away in a cloud of dust and humiliation. But Zeke knew this wasn't over. Men like Fletcher didn't give up. Their pride wouldn't let them. The threat would hang over their small family like a gathering storm cloud. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the mood in the house was tense. "Are we in danger, Zeke?" Constance asked quietly. Zeke looked at Mercy, who was pretending to read a book, but was listening to every word with wide, frightened eyes. "Maybe," he said honestly. He wouldn't lie to them. Not about this. "Fletcher's been after my water for years. He's a snake. He thinks having a family makes me weak." "Does it?" Constance asked, her gaze searching his. A year ago, Zeke would have said yes without hesitation. A family was a liability, a vulnerability. But now, looking at his wife, at the little girl who had become his daughter in every way that mattered, he felt something he hadn't felt in nearly a decade. A fierce, righteous purpose. A reason to fight. A reason to live. "No," he said finally, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised him. "It doesn't make me weak." He looked from Constance to Mercy, and a slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. "It makes me dangerous." The confrontation came 2 weeks later, and it came at dawn. Fletcher returned, but this time he brought a dozen men with him. They came thundering over the hill, intending to catch the family sleeping, to overwhelm them with sheer numbers. But Zeke had been expecting them, and he was ready. The fight was brief, brutal, and utterly one-sided. Zeke had the advantage of knowing his own land, every rock, every tree, every dip in the terrain. He had positioned himself in the hayloft of the barn, a perfect vantage point from which he could cover the house and the entire yard. When the first shots rang out in the pre-dawn gloom, Constance and Mercy were already safely hidden in the root cellar, just as he had instructed them. When the smoke finally cleared, 3 of Fletcher's men lay dead in the yard. Fletcher himself was on his knees, clutching a shattered shoulder, his face a mask of shock and pain. The rest of his men had fled, disappearing back over the hill like the cowards they were. Zeke walked out of the barn, his rifle still smoking in his hands. He walked over and stood before the wounded, defeated rancher. "This ends now, Fletcher," he said quietly. "You come after what's mine again, and I will finish what I started today. I will hunt you down, and I will erase you." Fletcher clutched his bleeding arm, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and fear. "You can't protect them forever, Blackwood," he hissed. "You got to sleep sometime." "Then I guess you better kill me clean the next time you try," Zeke replied, his voice devoid of pity. "Because if you don't, I will find you, and I will show you what a man with a family to protect is capable of. Now get off my land before I change my mind." Fletcher, with the help of one of his remaining men, got back on his horse and rode away, defeated and disgraced. He never returned. Word of the failed attack spread through the territory like wildfire. The legend of Zeke Blackwood, the quiet rancher who would kill to protect his family, was born, and that was enough to keep the other wolves at bay. That night, as Constance gently tended to a shallow cut on Zeke's cheek, she looked at him with a new understanding in her eyes. "I was wrong," she said softly. "About you being dangerous because of us. You were already dangerous, Zeke Blackwood. Having us, it just gave you a reason to use it for something good." Summer brought a season of peace and prosperity to the Blackwood Ranch. The cattle grew fat and multiplied. The grass in the valley was thick and green, and their little family, forged in tragedy and violence, grew closer and stronger with each passing day. Mercy learned to ride like she was born to the saddle, her laughter echoing across the fields. Constance, it turned out, had a sharp mind for numbers and a gift for managing the ranch's finances, freeing Zeke to focus on the land and the livestock. Zeke found himself laughing more than he had in all his years in Montana combined. The crushing loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long seemed like a distant, half-forgotten dream. One warm evening in late August, they were all sitting on the porch, watching the sky blaze with the colors of the sunset. Mercy, who was now 8 years old and full of a quiet confidence, finally asked the question that had been lingering in the air for months. Are we a real family now?" she asked, looking from Zeke to Constance. "Like a forever and always kind of family?" Zeke looked at Constance. She smiled, her eyes shining in the twilight, and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "What do you think, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked softly. Zeke looked at the two of them, his wife and his daughter, his family. He felt a wave of love and gratitude so powerful, it almost overwhelmed him. "I think," he said carefully, his voice thick with emotion, "that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing. It's about choosing to love someone and protect someone and stand by them every single day, even when it's hard." "So we chose each other?" Mercy asked, her eyes wide. "We chose each other," Constance confirmed, squeezing her hand. Mercy grinned, a wide, joyful, triumphant grin. She launched herself at them, wrapping her arms around both of their necks in a fierce hug. "Good," she said, her voice muffled against Zeke's shoulder. "Because I ain't ever letting go." As the first stars began to prick the deep purple canopy of the Montana sky, Zeke leaned back in his chair, his arm around his wife, his daughter nestled between them. He reflected on the strange, improbable journey that had brought them all to this perfect moment of peace. A year ago, he had been a ghost of a man, a hermit without hope, living in the long, dark shadows of his past. Now, he had a wife who challenged him, healed him, and loved him. He had a daughter who filled his days with purpose and laughter. He had a future that stretched out before them, bright and full of promise, like an unwritten book. It had all started with a desperate little girl's whispered, impossible plea. "Please marry my mama, mister. She's all I have now." But somewhere along the way, it had become so much more. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. They were loving. They were building something strong and beautiful from the ashes of their separate, broken lives. The winter that followed was harsh and unforgiving, but they weathered it together, warmed by the fire in their hearth and the love in their hearts. The following spring, Constance gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas, after Mercy's father. The little boy had Zeke's dark hair and Constance's gentle blue eyes, and he completed their family in a way none of them could have ever expected. Years later, when Mercy was grown and married, with children of her own running through the fields of the Blackwood Ranch, she would tell them the story of how their family came to be. She would speak of a silent, dangerous rancher who had shown them kindness when they had nothing left in the world. She would tell them of a beautiful broken mother who had found her way back from the deepest darkness, guided by love. And she would tell them of a family that was forged not by blood, but by something far stronger, by choice, by courage, and by an unbreakable, unyielding love. But on that long-ago night, as they sat together on the porch, the baby sleeping peacefully in Constance's arms and Mercy curled up sleepily between them, none of them needed to speak. They were home, they were safe, and they were together. And in the end, in the wild, unforgiving heart of the Montana Territory, that was all that ever truly mattered. If you were moved by Zeke and Constance's journey, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got so many more stories like this one coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one.